It's a good answer, Paul. I like it. Nacho, he's got another question. Go on, Nacho, based on that.
Linked to this one, what do you think that the causes of World War I affected how the generals acted?
Do you think the causes of World War I affected how the generals acted in the war?
I'm not sure so much the causes did. I mean, except perhaps you could argue for the French, because the French were very keen for revenge in 1914 because they'd been defeated 30 odd years before in the Franco-Prussian War. They'd had a huge area of French land taken away from them, and they wanted that back. So in 1914, France went to war against Germany with some enthusiasm. You could argue that they thought they were going to finally beat Germany. And the French generals thought they were going to fight a refight of the Franco-Prussian War, but this time win. But Germany's army, Prussia's army in 1871 was a good army. The German army in 1914 was an even better army, but France had not moved on. So the generals, because of the causes of the war and the previous war, went to refight that war, and it cost them dear. The French army in 1914, between the outbreak of war in August and the end of that year, lost over 300,000 men killed in action. 27,000 of them on a single day. So that's even more than the first day of the Battle of the Somme. It's because French soldiers, refighting the Franco-Prussian War, marched into battle in huge blocks of columns of men with red trousers, with soldiers, officers with white gloves, using their swords to point towards the enemy, and they walked straight into the industrial firepower of the Imperial German Army and were annihilated.
So I don't know if you caught that, but he's talking about the French at the beginning, wherein, thinking it was going to be easy. Yeah. Okay, Paul, next question is kind of going back to the Somme a bit, isn't it? This is Alvaro. Alvaro, say hello.
Hi, Alvaro.
Hi, Alvaro.
What was the difference between Allied and German tactics?
What was the difference between German and Allied tactics at the Somme?
That's a good question as well. Essentially, for most of the war, Germany was on a defensive position, that they'd realised at the beginning of the war they couldn't break through with the Schlieffen Plan and then the race to the sea, so they dug in, and that's when the Western Front came into being, 450 miles of trenches from the Belgian coast to the border of Switzerland. So they fought essentially defensive battles for most of the war, and the Somme for them was a defensive battle. And that means that they didn't have to do anything except sit there and wait for the British to attack them and then hopefully kill them in no man's land. The British, as I was mentioning earlier, they used a bit of a sledgehammer approach at the beginning of the Somme, where you use a lot of men and a lot of shells and you just try and overwhelm the enemy. And that wasn't well thought out, and it cost a lot of casualties because we didn't know the German shelters and so on. So you see a change in tactics with the British, with a better use of artillery, less rigid plans and so on. But the Germans, in many respects, are already one step ahead of us, because as we begin to push the Germans back, they don't just take it. Their idea of defence is an old military saying, the best form of defence is attack. So once the Germans had been attacked and lost a bit of ground, they would then counter-attack and try and take it. So General Ludendorff, senior German commander on the Somme, said to his troops, the British will not advance on the Somme except over the bodies of dead German soldiers. And what he meant by that was, if the British attack, we must instantly counter-attack and try and take that trench, that ground, that wood, that bunker, whatever it is, back again. And that's one of the reasons, because the Germans were continually attacking us once we attacked, one of the reasons why the casualty list for the end of the Battle of the Somme saw the German army suffer as many casualties as us, if not more, because they were throwing men time and again at our positions that we'd taken from them to try and take them back again, and in doing so suffered losses themselves.
Thanks, Paul. Great. Sarah has a question at the front.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Can you see? Hang on. I'll just see if you can. Wait a minute. Sarah? Wave? There's Sarah.
Hi.
Hi.
Do you
Do you think that school textbooks are a reliable source of evidence to young historians?
Well, I'm sure yours are. Like it wouldn't be just school textbook, but any book that you pick up to do with any aspect of history, you can't rely on one source. The whole thing about history is, as I mentioned earlier, is about looking at lots of different sources to see and make up your mind yourself as to what you think actually happened and your interpretation of it. Because history is about facts, but it's much more about interpretation of those facts. So you can have a long list of dates, you can have a long list of events, you can have a long list of casualties and generals' names and kings and commanders and everything like that. But the real essence of history is taking those facts and turning them into a story that has credibility. And one book will never do that. It can give you a starting point. So your school textbooks are about giving you a starting point. And then historical study is about taking that as your start point and then looking at other books to get a better idea of the bigger picture or of a deeper aspect of the picture. But you do have to be careful with books. I mean, there's a film about to come out about Holocaust denial, where there are people who deny that the Holocaust take place, and there are books published right across Europe where you will read this. You don't have to go very far on the internet to find this either. And that is a really good point about how important understanding historical inquiry is, because you need to know how to evaluate sources, how to comprehend whether a book is good, bad, biased, it's inspired by politics or current events, or is just propaganda. And studying history enables you to do that. But as I mentioned earlier, the wider aspects of history, it's good to help create an inquiring mind to challenge the things that you're told.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, is that Juan next? Juan at the front.
Hello.
You all right?
Yes, my question is, can you mention a source that you know of which was really useful for you to determine whether generals were good or not?
Okay, so a source that you've seen or you've used that's allowed you to understand more about whether the generals were competent or not.
Well, there's been a lot of really good writing in history in recent decades about the generalships of the First World War. If you go back to the 1960s, one of the most influential books was The Donkeys by Alan Clark. Now, Alan Clark wasn't an historian. He was a journalist and later a politician, and his work has been pretty much discredited now. But in recent times, books by people like Professor Gary Sheffield is a good example, and Peter Hart at the Imperial War Museum, their books have given us a different interpretation of the First World War, a more balanced interpretation of the First World War, looking at the problems that generals had and understanding the way they had to fight their battles and putting that into the context of the period. So work by them, for example, is a good way of looking at a different viewpoint of the generals. And if you want to have a counter argument to that, to see how for a long time people have viewed generals of the First World War, Alan Clark's Donkeys is the other end of the extreme, if you like. But Gary Sheffield's Forgotten Victory about the First World War is a classic book of recent times, really explaining a different angle on the generals of World War One.
Fantastic, excellent. Igor, he's taking his glasses off. He's getting ready, Paul, to ask you a question. Shout though, Igor, shout.
Good morning. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the trench life? Was it better than some people think, or was it horrible?
Okay, so he's actually saying, was living in the trench as bad as what people say, or was it actually not as bad as what people say?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. Now, if we go back 100 years, the men who fought in the First World War, they were much tougher than us. We all live in houses with central heating. If we're cold, we can press a button and the heating comes on and we're nice and warm, and we sleep in lovely, comfortable, warm beds, possibly with electric blankets and so on. And it's made us soft. It's made us, it makes it difficult for us to put up with extreme conditions. But they had grown up in houses that were very poor, that had very poor conditions. Most of them didn't have inside toilets. The only heating would be an open fire. So it was a very, very different world to ours. Now, they were tough, but 100 years ago now, on the Somme, the temperature was over -20. Now, that is cold.
Well, 100 years ago, this time of year, the temperature would have been -20 on the Somme battlefield. Okay, yeah. And imagine today in Vigo, it's 11 degrees. Out there, it's 11 at the moment. So it would be 30 degrees colder than it is out there at the moment on the Somme in France. Yeah. Sorry, Paul. Go on, Karen.
That's okay.
That's okay. No, I mean it was the coldest winter of the war, when everything froze up. Soldiers froze, the trenches froze, weapons froze up. Couldn't fight. The enemy was not the Germans, and for the Germans, the enemy was not the British or the French. The enemy was the weather, because you were fighting against the weather, and men froze to death in the trenches. So they were tough men, but they couldn't cope with those sort of conditions. And on a daily basis, that's an extreme example. On a daily basis, trenches were muddy holes in the ground. They often had water in them. They were uncomfortable. There was no proper sleeping areas. They were full of vermin, so rats. Soldiers would get lice, body lice. They'd be scratching themselves all the time. And it would be a very, very uncomfortable life. But they weren't living in the trenches all the time. So they would spend 7 to 10 days in the trenches, and then they would go out on rest to a village or in a barn or in a house somewhere behind the lines or in a tent, and then come back up to another 7 to 10 days, and then go back behind the line, do that for several times, and then go out to a town on rest. So what that meant was they spent equally as much time out of the trenches as in them. So they weren't always living in these muddy ditches. But as the war goes on, you see more and more men get sick. So you have casualties not from bullets or from bombs or from shells. You have men who become sick, who become ill through being in the trenches. So that gives you a bit of an idea as to how bad conditions could be, particularly in the winter, but throughout the year men would go sick. And a common thing with that was trench foot, where your feet would get wet. Now, I'm sure you've all got dishwashers at home, so you probably don't do this anymore, but if you wash up your sink, or if you sit in the bath too long, you've probably seen how your skin gets all wrinkly. Now, you imagine your feet being in water, not just for half an hour, but for a whole day or perhaps several days, and what your feet would look like after being like that. And that's what trench foot is. Your feet rot. They become rotten inside your boots. And the worst examples can be where the feet become gangrenous and they have to be amputated. So one of the veterans that I interviewed, one of his friends got trench foot so badly that he lost both his feet, and he went home crippled from his experience, and literally crippled from his experience in the First World War, and could never work again
As a consequence
of it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Sophia, we'll come back to you, Luis, in a minute. Oh, go on, Luis. What is it?
We saw before a documentary of that they were trying to get a village that would empower Germans. How many?
Yeah, it was you on with Cheryl, Paul. Guimon, was it? Guimon. Yeah, go on.
If they conquer the village, would be the life mercy for bringing soldiers and taking them back.
What do you mean?